Sorry we're running a little late, but we had a fascinating presentation and it was well worth it. Now we have a legislative panel, and we're delighted to have Representative Mauree Turner with us and Senator Mary Boren. And Senator George Young, we're hoping he had a scheduling mix-up, and we're hoping he'll be here around noon. They're going to talk about what they see, the white Christian nationalism they see in Oklahoma, especially the legislature, public education, whatever evidence of white Christian nationalism they see in Oklahoma is the topic today. So each of our legislators will talk for 5 or 10 minutes on their own, and then we'll get a panel discussion going on, and Joe's welcome to come in and join him for the discussion. Joe Bessler is the theology professor at Phillips Seminary, who is our first speaker this morning. Mauree, you want to start?
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Mauree Turner. I think what I'll just kind of start with is a little bit about how I ended up in the Oklahoma legislature, which I think kind of helps for me kind of guide this conversation a little bit. So I was born and raised in Ardmore, Oklahoma, right before you cross into Texas, and I've grown up on this little stretch of I-35 from Ardmore to Norman to Oklahoma City to Langston to Stillwater. When they first start asking you what you want to be around early childhood center, first grade, for me it was always a veterinarian. My mom and my grandmother and my aunt and my uncle were always in the healthcare field, and so I was like, okay, then I guess the healthcare field is it. But I know I'm not a people person, so I was like, animals. But I think the big thing for me is that at every step along the way, the things that that my life showed me, that my family showed me, really were formative in me being in the Oklahoma legislature. So my mom, single parent, my dad was in prison up until I was in middle school, and my mom worked 2 and 3 jobs our entire lives. She just recently is down to 1, so very proud of her for that one. So in elementary school, if I was missing school, right, or if I was missing school, it was likely because we couldn't afford childcare, and my mom would take us with her to her different jobs. So for me, one of the most formative things I remember is being able to go and sit in community listening and learning sessions, support groups for folks living with HIV and AIDS, and what that looked like to be supportive of members in our, back then, just LGBT community, which allowed me to see myself in ways that I hadn't before, right? It gave me language for things I didn't know, which also allowed me to come out to my mom in the 2nd grade. Which is something that not a lot of Oklahomans get, right? And that's not lost on me. I think another big thing is that if my mom wasn't around, that we were also latchkey kids, right? Which meant that we walked to the public, and could have been anywhere and everywhere, right? But I spent a lot of time at the public library. My favorite librarian, Miss Sonia, taught me the Dewey Decimal System and how to find what I'm looking for, different things like that. But I think about the different ways community touched my life and allowed me to be here in this aspect, because I also remember my first time in front of a DA and the scary trajectory that my life could have gone. So I just think about the different aspects of community that allowed me to see myself, right? I think about the good that public libraries provide for our communities, far beyond just being able to check out a book or a DVD or something like that, right? But the community it provides, right? From citizenship classes to lecture halls for you to rent, right? A space to come together and really see yourself, right? Which I think is so formative for students nowadays. by the time I finally left Ardmore and went to Stillwater for school, I was so scared because I realized it was the first time I was going to be going to a public education system or into an education institution that I wouldn't have another sibling with. My other sibling was just, I guess, about 25 minutes up the road at Langston. But being on OSU's campus was far different than spending time with my sister on Langston's campus. And so I went to my classes and I went to my pre-vet club, and that was it. I didn't do anything. And so I called my mom and I said, like, I don't really want to go back to school. Like, I've tried it and I don't think it's for me. And she was like, I think you should give it another shot. And so we sat down with my counselor and just talked about the other opportunities and how to get involved outside of just the coursework. And then I found the NAACP, or should I say they found me. I was sitting on, like at the student union, just at a table, and this girl came up and she said, like, I've seen you around a little bit and I think you should come to our NAACP meeting. Her name is Danielle King. She was the president of our NAACP at the time. And I was like, okay, yeah, sure. So I went, and by the end of, I think like the second meeting I attended, I was the assistant secretary. And so I think about, like, that was like my first step into, because I loved volunteering. My very first volunteer job was at the public library handing out pink lemonade and popcorn on movie days on Saturdays, right? Like, I just loved being able to be useful and be helpful. And joining the NAACP in college allowed me to make that connection between, like, I can be useful and be helpful, right? And not just for like different things that I really care about, right? But also for my community in different ways, right? Because I think that was something I struggled with, was like finding a place to fit in and be useful. That really resonated with me and my identity. Because as a Black, queer, trans Muslim in Oklahoma, like, there aren't that many places where I can fully see myself, right? And so the NAACP really kind of flung open a door for being able to connect in these different ways. And so from there, I was like, okay, like, I found out about the Council on American Islamic Relations because I took a religious course at my time at OSU too. I was, you name it, I probably did it, spent way too much time there. And that was when I met Adam Soltani from the Council on American Islamic Relations. And I was so enamored. I was like trying to figure out like how I get in touch with this organization. And so I ended up getting in touch and interning for them. And then I joined the board. And then we were putting on an event here in Oklahoma City. And I got a call that my dad had a bad automobile accident and was meta-flighted to the city. And so for the next week, I sat by his side in the hospital and got to hear through an adult and process through a somewhat adult lens that I wasn't able to do when I was a child. Because when he was released from prison for the last time was when I was in those like early teenage angst years. And so I was internalizing the message from my community that if he ended up in jail or in prison, it was just because he wanted to. He was a bad person and he didn't want a life with us. So for the next week, right, fast forward to college, right, the care banquet, for the next week, I got to sit by his side and hear how my dad, my baba, he wanted to be a teacher, right? He cared so much, but he was in a public education system where his teachers were continuously telling him that he should go ahead and give up, right? Like that he wasn't going to amount to anything. And a lot of us become products of our environment for the better or for worse, right? And so that was the moment, and I was going to school and I was studying animal science, political science, and sociology. I am also a bit of a workaholic. So I was doing this, I was in all these clubs and organizations, but like that week was when I realized that like my life, I think, would feel so much more fulfilled. And I felt like my calling was to figure out how we shift Oklahoma's criminal legal system. Back then, I used to think of it as criminal justice reform. And I think my years in working in it, for me, it's been kind of eye-opening that maybe it's not a system that can be reformed, right? It is working flawlessly as it was created, but it is a system that we can tear down and recreate with our communities in mind, right? We can reimagine and rebuild the justice system from our communities outward. And so my mom always tells me, don't quit a job before you get another job. And this was the one time I did not take her advice. And I quit my job at the university, and I had started the interview process at the ACLU of Oklahoma, but hadn't heard anything back just yet. And my last little Hail Mary, I guess, so to speak, was I did a study abroad in India and Sri Lanka to figure out how nonprofits work over there, and also to tour a couple of vet schools, just in case. And I was sitting there, I got the job offer while I was in India, and I came back and I started work at the ACLU the day after I got back. In my time at the ACLU, there were a couple of big things that we were able to do, and I am a community organizer. I love to be able to build the things behind the scenes and then let everybody else step out front. So the past 3 years have been a little jarring for me, but I think the big thing there was that, like, the ACLU often told us that, like, we are not direct service providers, right? And me as a community organizer, always trying to figure out how we shift systems. I'm trying to figure out how we circumnavigate that. How do we provide direct services, right? Or what are the ways that we can? And so we decided to start doing drag shows. I was like, well, what if we do drag shows and we don't take any of the proceeds from the donations, we just give them to the people who need them? And at this point in time, I think our first drag show was for the intersection of crimmigration, our criminal legal system and immigration. There had been a raid in Ardmore and in Stillwater simultaneously that took a lot of community members who were undocumented from their homes, from their children, from their spouses. And so we did a fundraiser to be able to help provide them with money for legal fees, for groceries, if people had been, like, deported, like, because the closest immigration court that we have is in Texas, right? So also, like, traveling fees, things like that. And I think the thing since becoming elected is that, like, I have become increasingly long-winded. So ultimately what I'll say is that, like, what I do, I don't think is revolutionary, right? I don't think what we as progressive policymakers do is revolutionary, right? The most revolutionary thing that we are doing is imagining how to care for our communities in a creative way that is different than what we've already been given, right? Because in order to get something different, we have to do something different. And politics in Oklahoma has been working the same way, in my humble opinion, like, regardless of party, for a very, very long time. Which is, I guess, is like the most contentious thing about me, is that I ran to the left of a Democrat. And because, yet again, right, as someone who is very intersectional and deeply religious, I was tired of being continuously cut out, right? Like, when we got those policy wins at the end of the day, it often looked like a part of me or multiple parts of me being cut out of those policy wins, and folks saying, well, we'll come back and get you in the circle around, right? Or you get to celebrate with us and we don't have to talk about you out loud. And I grew up in a Baptist church. My mom Baptist, my dad Muslim, and they raised us with principles from both, right? And none of those said that we get to leave people out when we are fighting for liberation, right? That people have to be in a closet of our own making in order for us to get liberation or justice. And so all of that really, I think, helps me, and it's something I think about continuously, figure out how to take care of my communities in the most robust way and not leave anybody out that we are actively thinking about, right? And so in making sure that we are always continuously thinking about how to be more inclusive, right? Because I never at the end of the day want to say I made a policy and yeah, I knew that we left people out, but we'll come back and get them in the circle around. Because what we can see, right, with white nationalism, like, deeply ingrained in a lot of policy across the nation and in Oklahoma, is that some of our community members, a lot of our communities won't survive that circle back for policy that will include them later, right? And also we are fighting apathetic voters, right? Trying to bring them in by saying, like, oh, okay, well, it could be worse, so maybe you should get on board. But when we could be saying, like, and we're thinking about you now, and we're including you now. It's not just the policy that we make and we vote on in those 4 months out of the year, February through May, right? But it's also how we survive those policies when they go into implementation, right? How can we gear up for them in those 8 months out of the year too? So I just think it's really important to talk about a little bit of what brings us to the work. And so I think that's all I want to say.
Well, thank you all for showing up on a Saturday to address this issue. I think in Oklahoma, it is particularly challenging, and I do think Oklahoma is a safe haven for Christian nationalism. I think we are attracting people with that worldview to Oklahoma from other places that they feel is less hospitable to that view. And I could go through all these anecdotes and ways that I've noticed that, but I would encourage you all to track any data or anything of who's coming into Oklahoma and who's leaving. I was at the tag agency in Cleveland County. I'm from Norman, Oklahoma, Mauree, Boren. I grew up in Southwest Oklahoma in Tipton. My parents were house parents at a Tipton Children's Home, which was a Church of Christ children's home. So I was outnumbered by children's homes kids, which is basically their position was like a foster child, and my parents were like the foster parents. So we had Bible bowls, went to church camp, had little quizzes all the time, every kind of Bible memorization, book, chapter, verse, skill drill thing that you could think of. That was my norm. And then I went to Cameron University. I wanted to go to Oklahoma Christian, but I didn't have enough money. And because I was really a goody two shoes Christian, knew who was going to hell, knew who was going to heaven, had it all figured out. And I thought grace was this little tightrope that you could fall off of if you thought a naughty thing. You could fall off into a pit of hell. So that's what I lived under for a long time. And I went to Cameron because I got a full paid scholarship. Don Davis was there, and he was the president at that time. So I was a presidential leader scholar there. And then I didn't know how to get a communications job. My major was communications, and I was on the debate team. And my uncle in Tennessee told me I should go to law school. And so I took my Pharisee, but shameful, scorned, because when you live as a Pharisee, you're always keeping really good track of all the horrible sins that you've committed, that you're just hoping you don't fall into hell. And then you're also worried about all your loved ones and friends and all the naughty things that they're doing at college. You're just on pins and needles thinking of all these people going to live in eternity for hell. So I was just a mess of survivor guilt, trying to be a perfect girl because I had parents, everybody else in the world didn't have parents. And I needed to make sure I didn't, abuse that opportunity. Don't do anything wrong. I mean, I was kind of and I made straight A's because of all that. And so then I went to law school and carried all that with me. And then when I was getting married to my husband, was from Little Axe area, and he was in undergrad and he wanted to go to medical school. We went up to Quail Springs Church of Christ, and they have a lot more bandwidth on the whole grace thing, and they kind of pushed the envelope a little bit. And then I started reading the NIV Bible. I switched over from King James over to NIV when I was in my 20s, which that's kind of funny because that shows you how much I had it, and I say I'm a recovering Pharisee. I'm how Paul in the Bible, you see him go from here to there. And that's the way, that was my walk too. And then, all along, I was very aware of the marginalization of people of color. So I was never okay with any of that. But I didn't have a lot of real formal teaching on it. So when I was in Cameron, I was on the Black History Bowl because my friends on the debate team said, you should be on the Black History Bowl. So, oh, okay. So here I am, I'm at a competition, and Langston is, lined up over here, and we got our table, and And then it came around to my turn, and the answer was Michael Jackson. And I was so embarrassed because almost any American of any shade could figure out that that was the answer, to that particular trivia question. And I was like, I want a hard one because I was like really studying. But there were some that flipped over, and I was so glad it didn't come to me because I didn't know it. But all of that is to say is that I had a part of me, a lane. Also, when I was in the 80s, I don't know how many of you remember when Roots came out, the movie and the series. And I think we watched, y'all remember that? And I was in my elementary school years, but before I moved to Tipton, we lived in Plainview, Texas. And that was around 1972. And it's a teacher college. And my second grade teacher was an African-American woman. And now I look back on that, I'm like, that's odd in West Texas that you ended up with an African-American teacher. And she was phenomenal. And she went to church on Wednesday nights because one night it was Wednesday, and she goes, well, I've got church tonight. I was like, you go to church on Wednesday, just like me? And, but I thought she was Cinderella. I really did. I just admired her so much. And when I look back on her pedagogy and her the things she was doing, she used positive behavior intervention. She did positive behavior reinforcement, which was very progressive. And so I think before I went into the children's home, I had this view of this woman, and my mother and dad were raised in Tennessee. And I rewind the tape and I asked my mom, I said, Mom, why didn't you pull me out of her class? Because that would have been a normal thing for a Tennessee mom to do. And she goes, well, I knew prejudice was wrong, and I knew it was taught to me, and I didn't want to keep doing that. And that's all. Like, she just had like this gut feeling, like, I don't want to do that. But she also realized that she had that, all that training and conditioning. So I was very, very grateful. But I think as a little girl, that prepared me later on when Roots came out, and then when I went to college. And I always had a lane in my head about, how do we fix this? What are we supposed to do with this? How do we repair this? What is the right response? And then, of course, studying Christ, you see him repairing and dealing with all of these kinds of prejudices. And I tell you what, if you want to make a Christian evangelical mad, pull out James, where James tells, don't show favor to the wealthy people on the front row, and it's the wealthy people ripping you off, and y'all need to wake up. Like, I got in the biggest fight with one of my very closest Christian friends by saying, she was talking about work and pay and, probably labor rights or something. And I just dropped that little verse there, and she's like, don't drop Bible verses at me. So I'm like, okay. I was trying to encourage you, So it taught me a lesson that when it comes to the abuses of capitalism, American Christianity, for the most part, the dominant version, it doesn't want to even come anywhere close to that. And you will not find anywhere in the Bible where capitalism is outlined as that you got to do that. Here's a situation when we're talking about, we hear about Christian nationalism through student loan repayment debt, I think, and we also hear it about interest loans. We are paying interest. We were debating a bill that Senator Yeck had, and it was a no interest loan. It was a loan, but had no interest on it. I don't even remember what it was for. Something about land or use of land or a business or a rural business. I can't remember who was going to get zero interest loans, but the whole room just kind of started falling apart. That's not fair. You can't do that. Da, da, da. And one of the biggest Christian nationalists, I knew he was that way. I said, do you know how many I went to the side, and this is the way I've learned to talk about it. You can't call them out in public because their ego and everything just like, it just won't work. So I'm more like Nicodemus, and I'm like coming over here in the dark of the night and having this little sidebar conversation. So I went up to him and I was standing by him. I said, do you know how many Bible verses say that interest loans are bad? He goes, no. I'm like, he's Mr. acts like he knows the Bible. I said, yeah, there's a lot. So got out my little phone and on a little sticky note, and I started writing them all out. But usury in the Old Testament in Leviticus is like, it's straight up there with like all the really horrible things like you're not supposed to do is don't charge. It's like, don't charge any interest, and sure as heck don't charge a lot of interest. And there was all this regulatory stuff about interest rates over in the Old Testament about how much, and if they were, you know, pagan or not, how much you could charge them. But even then there was a limit to it. So anyway, I think I found like 6 Bible verses about why you're not supposed to charge people interest. And he hasn't responded to me about that. So I would think when dealing with Christian nationalism, it's very important for especially with us in the faith, and I think you see this from Sam Perry's work. He's my constituent. He's from Norman. Is to be grounded in Scripture. There is a lot of Scripture that refutes this. And I think that's really important. And that's what Sam encouraged us to do, is that people within the faith have the opportunity and I think the responsibility, especially in Oklahoma, to lay out why this is wrong. It's not even scriptural. So I think we need to be able to show an account for that. Another way that you see, I think, you know, Sam Perry's book talks about, it's not about faith, it's about control. So you'll see a whole slew of things that are a matter of the heart that they want to criminalize or regulate. And you'll hear Christian nationalists or evangelicals talk about gun safety. And who was the guy that was just, it was, I can't remember. He was either a state rep, a United States senator or United States representative. And you'll hear them say, like, if there is, when it comes to gun violence, it's a matter of the heart and nothing's going to fix it unless they have Jesus. Okay, it was Mike Johnson, yeah. So it's interesting to see all the other things that aren't a matter of the heart, that they're systemic and they need to be regulated. So there's like this division of how they have their things that are only Jesus can fix that. And then there's this other category of you have to have the really heavy-handed hand of the government to fix. And I think that's kind of interesting to see how they, and that when you see them, you'll see that they're not trying to develop authentic faith or authentic religion. They're trying to create an order system where they retain power and they retain control. And that's what you see all the way back with Jesus's dispute with the Pharisees. Just this week, I was reading about in John, where the man that was by the pool of Bethesda, and he's, they call it crippled, but we don't call it that anymore, but he was disabled and he was trying to get into the pool. And Jesus said, "What do you want?" He goes, "I can't get into the pool." Well, what he wanted to do is to be healed. He wanted to walk, but he didn't have enough agency to say, to even think about what his vision for his life was. He was just trying to get to this remedy. And of course, as we all know, that Jesus healed him, but the Pharisees really lost it because he healed somebody on the Sabbath. So they were elevating religion above people or humanity. And you see that all through Christian nationalism, is where you dehumanize a group of people to advance religious control. And there's usually dehumanizing language that goes in the mix. Even, you know, and I try within, this is another thing I think we should do as those that are trying to refute Christian nationalism. I think it's very, very important for us to not use dehumanizing language. And Mauree, I don't know how you monitor yourself. I think you're probably very good at it, but it's very tempting to call somebody that's doing horrific things, we'll call them animals, they're monsters, they're you know, I just try to really keep a rule that we call people by their names. We can describe their behavior, but they are humans. And we have to model the non-dehumanizing of other people. Because if either side's doing it, then it becomes, that's how you end up with genocide, and that's how you end up with unable to have peace in the world, is because your mind is open that if you're morally right, then you have the right to dehumanize other people. That's what went all the way back from the founding of the United States and colonialism was, these people are civilized because they have Jesus, and these people aren't civilized because they don't have Jesus. And then they treat them as non-evolved moral agents. You also see at the legislature taking away free will, matters of the heart, the matters of conscience, that they want to regulate those. And they don't want people to have the liberty, the freedom to work out their salvation with God, or to work out their moral decisions with their faith. And that's where you're getting into the banned book stuff. That's where you're getting into even, I think, the LGBTQIA issues, even about sex ed. All of that is to control the pathway of thought that your mind can go down, and they just want to leave things completely off the buffet of human thought. And y'all can have peas and chicken. And they have a very binary, and they'll also categorize, are you for this or are you for that? And there's not any middle ground. And that you see that in reproductive choice issues. And there is a middle ground for most Americans, and most Oklahomans really are in a middle ground, that they value the life of the unborn. It's honorable. It's to be honored. It's not to be just, back in the 70s, a lot of people would just say it's just tissue. Now we know through science and sonograms and all this other stuff, there's a lot more going on there. And there's a lot of people that want to treat that with honor and sacred. But you don't have to go step over into the moral agency of women and exploit women in a vulnerable place to advance a political narrative and to get political power. And I have a bill that Mauree won't get heard, which shouldn't surprise you, but I've had it 3 years and I file it every year. And I've even referred to it with the NCAA, saying that sports, the National Sport Organization gets to determine what the parameters of participation are going to be. Like, they could do weight, they could do size of weight, they could do all kinds of things. And of course, the very conservative voices in Oklahoma start, wrapping themselves in the Title IX flag all of a sudden. Here's Title IX, it protects women's sports. And so they, wrap themselves up in it. Well, the private religious colleges in Oklahoma have a Title IX waiver. They have waived themselves from having to comply with Title IX when it comes to women getting pregnant in their colleges. Title IX says you can't discriminate against pregnant athletes or pregnant students, that they should be able to continue their education, that they should be able to have a pathway to continue their participation in sports if their performance level is the same or could be, brought back in. Title IX protects pregnancy on college campuses. Well, almost everyone, I think OCU might not, because I think OCU hasn't, but almost every private religious college in Oklahoma has waived that restriction. They've asked the federal government to waive the burden of not discriminating against pregnant women in college. And I have a cousin who was a soccer scholar. She had a soccer scholarship at a private university. And I'm not about shaming any private university. I don't want to, because any one of them would have done this. Anyway, she got pregnant with her current husband of 30 years. And she lost her soccer scholarship, and she wasn't able to be on the team. And she continued to play soccer intramurals for or even in an adult league for 10 years. I mean, she was a really good little athlete. And so she lost her scholarship, and then she had to keep paying as she went forward. So that tells you that there's no middle ground. That's the way I see that. There's no middle ground. There's no, what are we really trying to value? How are we trying to really help vulnerable women that are in a crisis pregnancy? That's not their goal. Their goal is to control a religious narrative for political power. That's their goal. And I think that's what Sam Perry's book points out. We also have a lot of Christian nationalist prayers offered they come in and out. And I've gotten pretty good at knowing which kind of religious leader is going to go in that direction and which one isn't. If they're Methodist, First Christian, there's a few other, Episcopalian. I'm pretty okay, I think this is pretty safe. They're not going to go, in that direction. Or if I know their work and I've read and I've followed them on social media and I kind of know. But I can kind of tell which denominations are really, when they show up on a place and it's political, meaning legislators are in the audience, or there's, flags or any kind of political nature to it, I would be a good hedge bet, for Las Vegas to decide, is it going to be a Christian nationalist prayer or not? I have a pretty good gauge because I stay up in my office when that's about to happen. Because personally, when I hear it, it is such a huge distraction for me in my faith personally. It is very, it takes me a good half day to get my wits about me when I see my faith being hurtful like that. It's a huge distraction, and it takes me off of almost everything I'm trying to do because it's just so painful. It's so hurtful. It's been hurtful throughout human history. Anytime a religious dominant group uses their religious power to exert and oppress people to conform to their religion throughout human history, that has been a very, very horrible dynamic. And I hate to see my faith being used that way. So that's why I keep track of it. It's not like I'm trying to play gotcha with them. It's just I have to move through the day. So there's phrases in Christian nationalist prayers, and one of them is, when they return to me, when they return to God, or where God's talking in the Bible, when they return to me, when their hearts return to me, I will rise up their nation and bless them. So they're taking the theology of the Israel nation in the Old Testament, and they're trying to bring forward a theocracy in the new now, and they're skipping over the whole New Testament that talks about how that Jesus didn't do that. And it also deals with the end times. So, and I think all the pastors in the room or theologians, I think we need to brush up on our end times theology, because there's 3 different strands, maybe 4 different interpretations of the end times. In Oklahoma, we have one dominant strand that everything goes back around. So this reestablishing Jesus as the ruler, or a Christian theocracy, is all wrapped up in this end times narrative. And I think we're kind of dropping the ball on clarifying that, hey, y'all, that's not the only one. I know that Church of Christ was not taught that. We have a third one that's very rare, and and I don't even know it that well. I just know that there's 3, and I don't do the Left Behind series of those books. I didn't even read that wasn't even anywhere on my radar. But the people that pray that way for God to reestablish himself almost like a theocracy in America, it's wrapped up into their end times theology. And I think we need to do a better job of letting the average person know that that's not the only interpretation, and that what Jesus's teachings and how he lived was separate. It would be in opposition to what they're presenting. So that's my observations of just the highlights of how I see Christian nationalism at the Capitol, and I understand that we want to take questions now. Okay. Okay.
And you can just pass that mic back and forth between you. Let me just ask a couple of policy areas. Like what have you seen in the way of the anti-critical race theory laws at the legislature and what they're trying to accomplish with that?
What? Okay, I'm gonna act like I don't know, this is not appropriate, but I'm gonna do it anyway. My front porch analysis, psychological, theological analysis, and also living as a white person. The anti-critical race theory stuff challenges the moral assumption of moral rightness of white people. And I noticed within myself that when I walk through a room, or if somebody like assumes something, like I have a bad motive. Hi, I'm Mary, and I can tell their response is, you have bad motives. And they don't even know anything about me. I'm like, oh my gosh, like, this is horrible. And I'm like, why are you getting so worked up about somebody wanting you to justify that you have a good motive? And I'm like, well, this is all my self-talk. Well, I think that people just should presume that I have good motives. Why should I have to prove that I have good motives? I'm like, well, where did you get that from? Why do you think that you get to walk around the world and everybody presumes that you have good motives? What caused you to think that? What caused you to act like that? The other part of me says, do you know of anybody that has to walk around the world and is not presumed to have good motives and has to prove every freaking motive that they've ever had? And I'm like, yeah, you know, my educated brain that's read a lot says, oh yes, I do. I do know people. And I've worked in the criminal justice system. Yes, I do know people that have to do everything perfectly when they're pulled over by the police to show that they do not have bad motives. Every little body language blink of an eye is assessed whether or not they have good motives or not. So then I talked to myself, well, then who do you think you are that you get to do that? So what caused you to think that you get to walk around the world with pure motives unless you just straight up do something horrible? And it's because I walk around with white skin everywhere. That's why when I go knock doors in Norman at 8 o'clock at night after sundown, and they see this little frumpy 57-year-old little white lady trying to, looks like a school counselor with a little cardigan on, opens the door. Does that the same for all my volunteers? No, and we know that when we knock doors. We know that the doors don't open the same for somebody that presents themselves like I do and somebody else. CRT messes all that up. CRT asks questions like, who in power benefits from the immigration problem? Who in power benefits from not solving that problem? Who in power benefits from global warming? Who in power benefits from low voter turnout? Because people in power fix problems that matter to them. And that's what CRT asks, and that's why they don't like it. Because they want to be able to continue going down this path where they don't have to justify any motive. They don't have to justify anything that, unless they do something horrible, whatever horrible is. If they just wake up and eat their cornflakes and go to work, they're to be presumed innocent. But that doesn't apply to everybody else. And that's why they don't like that there's this theory out there that will check that. Also, CRT is about systemic change because they actually, I think we would find a lot more protection, because what it asks is, how come all these well-meaning white people couldn't figure out how to get black professors at Harvard? That was the question. They care about racism. They don't want to be racist. They're trying to fix the problem. So why are all these non-racist
white led Harvard University Law School, why haven't they figured out how to get Black professors to teach Black students at their college? And then it led to systemic problems. And that's what CRT is about, is it's looking at systems that get reinforced over time, and that unless you deliberately undo those, you don't get to fix it. So it actually presumes that people have good intent and that it's the systems that are the problem. It's not the people. But they're also wanting to protect systems too. They also don't like the messenger of, I can't remember his name. They don't like the messenger. They don't like how it came out of the summer of 2020 in May. They don't like that. So that level of accountability and culturally,
1619 project, is that what you're talking about?
yeah, and the 1619 project, they don't. And after George Floyd's murder, they don't like the accountability and they don't like the empowerment. And so all of it just freaks them out. And then they're just like, now, and they're not okay with having gotten rid of CRT in Oklahoma. Now they're going for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And most of my liberal friends and professors thinks that's the most watered down effort towards responding to diversity. Am I accurate, Mauree? Sometimes you hear that, sometimes. Yeah. Someone went, you can check a DEI box and still be like really needing a lot of help. So they're not even wanting to go through the little basic training wheels steps of DEI. They're trying to get rid of that too. And all of it is to get everything shifted back over to the way it was in the 1940s, the 1930, like 1945, where you walk down the street and there's a presumption of innocence and wonderfulness for a certain group of people, and in your ability to assimilate over into that group of people. And then there's a presumption of guilt, and you need to follow your P's and Q's if you won't assimilate over into this group, or you don't have the ability, or you aren't. And they're still trying to do this sorting of everything because it benefits them. They think it does, but the world has totally changed since then. And there's no way in Oklahoma we can benefit by acting that way. I will tell you though, one thing, DEI, and Mauree, you can correct me, but DEI, even in Oklahoma, is a mainstreamed way of trying to live peacefully in a diverse community. You can take an Edmond soccer mom and you can ask her, if her kids are in public schools, how important is it for you for your kid to go to a diverse school? I bet you 75% of them say, very important. Now, how much effort they put to that, that's a whole nother issue. But the way they see the world, they want their kids to be good friends, especially if they're in a public school. That's the reason they go to public school, is to teach your kids how to be friends with kids that have less money, to be friends with kids that have single moms, to be friends with fill in the blank. That's why people are choosing public schools, because they now have other choices. The people that are afraid of that, they're segregating themselves out. But if you look even in Edmond, the most Edmondy mom that you can think of, if you pulled her to the side, I would say there's a 75% chance that they would say that diversity matters to them. Even in the corporate world, they know that it matters. If you work for AT&T or the airlines or any of that, but there's this really radical side in Oklahoma that even wants to push that out. They're offended by that. And Senator Standridge from Norman had an interim study on it. Y'all can go back and listen to what those speakers were saying, but it will tell you how that they're, because they took care of CRT, now they're trying to make DEI like CRT. And it's really not anything like that. It is really a watered down diversity, basic ways of not sounding like a really severe knucklehead at work. How many of y'all watch The Office? Did y'all ever watch that? Well, there's this horrible, this goofy, bad manager has this diversity training day, and he does every faux pas, every horrible thing you could ever say at work about diversity, and it's so cringy. But DEI basically makes it so you don't sound like Michael Scott at work. It really is just to help you not say a bunch of stupid stuff at work. It doesn't change I mean, you could really hide a lot of racism behind DEI and just know how to present yourself of not being a horrible, ignorant person. So that's the two realms of CRT and DEI
Okay.
that I see.
And Mauree, if you would also address, is the goal to stop teaching Black history in Oklahoma?
Yeah, I mean, realistically, I think so, right? Because we saw that piece of legislation, I think like 1775 back in 2022, I think. And then we saw how in the, like maybe that was 2021, because then in the following session, I think in 2022, we saw Representative Waldron out of Tulsa write a piece of legislation that said like, but we should specifically continue to teach about the Holocaust, right? And so it made it evident, right, that for the folks who were paying attention to things like that, it made it very evident that they were okay with being taught a certain type of history and not like Black history or Indigenous history, right? History that would make white people question themselves in Oklahoma, right? Especially folks who are like, oh yeah, I'm a 5th generation Oklahoman. Okay, and what does that look like for your family? Like, what does that like look like here? And so, yeah, I definitely think so. Or not, I wholeheartedly believe so. I think it's also a really like, I think I'll say that because I want to make sure that you get to the questions that you want to have. But yeah.
I just want to say one thing. To add on to it, it's not even that creative too. They just do what Florida does. They go to these little goofy camps, or I shouldn't be so derogatory. So they go to these conservative branding camps or retreats, and they all come back, oh, this is what we're doing now. And so they take the bill and then they put it in Oklahoma, and they have like this little scorecard that they're just trying to get there. We're such good conservatives. So they're not even thinking about what they want, where they want us to go. They're just trying to keep up with the conservatives throughout the United States, and they don't want to not keep up with the brand. And they're trying to brand themselves as the most conservative state. And that's just one of the things, getting rid of Black history. That's one of the things that they, and if you ask them, like, do you think we should teach about, Greenwood behind the scenes? Oh yeah, you got to talk about that. And they'll go to the museum, but it's so disconnected. But really a lot of it is ego. Are we a good conservative state? And they will self-destruct just trying to chase that A+ conservative state brand.
What about, let's get into Ryan Walters a little bit. What about the requirement to teach patriotic history and what that's doing to public school teachers in Oklahoma?
Yeah, I think the thing, like, I think specifically when we were talking about like white Christian nationalism and like what that looks like, what I often have been thinking is that like because I have a lot of intersections, I'm always trying to figure out like what's connected where and like how we can have those conversations so folks can see how these things are connected and like hopefully motivate people to get engaged. But like, I think a lot about how Haza is 2 million people, right? That's half the population of Oklahoma. 50% of that population is youth under the age of 18, right? I think about how Ryan Walters and folks like Kevin Stitt, right, Governor Stitt, right, are essentially trying to create a white Christian nationalist ethno-state here in Oklahoma, right? And in order to complete that, right, with religious schools that are backed by public education dollars, right? We also have to talk about a history that makes folks like feel empowered to continue to do things, right? Like, and so they have to create an education. What is it called? Not a rubric, but curriculum that makes themselves and the students that they are trying to reach feel empowered, right? And also others, the students that they don't want to teach, right? Because Black history, Indigenous history, like that empowers people to say like, oh, right, I didn't realize that happened in Oklahoma. I didn't know, right? Like you saw that like with when we get folks elected in positions or in places that we never thought, like my election, right? Like so many folks were like, I didn't know that we could have a place in politics, right? I didn't see myself there, and so I didn't think that we could be there. And like that is like when we have 1775 from 2021, right? When we have pieces of legislation like that, or when we have book bans that allow, like some of them were just like, oh yeah, like I do have two mommies, like what that looks like, right? Like when we deny kids like very moldable minds to be able to see themselves or be able to see what equity looks like through the lens of books, through education, right, through curriculum, we deny a populace that actually has the creativity to create something more than what we've been given in the past, than what we've done in the past. And we set ourselves up for failure to recreate the past in the worst ways. So, did I answer your question?
Yeah, so to create this like the virtues of colonialism back, like if you were in charge of North America way back in like 1619 or let's say 1670, there would have been this justification for how you were treating people. And that history that Ryan Walters, like we anchor in back into our patriotic traditional American history, is to like reclaim those virtuous, like put virtue on a lot of these aspects and ignore the accountability for the abuse of authority. And in the South during the Jim Crow years, that was very much happening in the apologies, in the reframing of what the Civil War was about. It wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights, and just shifting things a little bit so where it wasn't so accountable towards not being, participating in genocide. But in their worldview, they have this under Jesus and everybody else, and only people under Jesus get to be in office. And I actually had a long Facebook fuss with a friend of mine's son who has a law degree, I think. And it was about, could an atheist, could an agnostic, could a non-Christian be trustworthy and have the moral integrity to be in elected office? And I was like, yeah, because it's not guaranteed just because you show up at church every week that you're going to be trustworthy. Like there's an accountability thing that goes along with that. You can't just put on a Sunday dress and show up and then, okay, now you get to go wander the world without any accountability that you're presumed infallible. But that's how they see the world. And if you really dig down, you'll start seeing these little conversations. And that's one of the things that you'll see in Sam Perry's book and in his work. One of the questions is, do you think people that are non-Christian should have positions of power? And then in some of the very radical right world, they are trying to get that if anybody is not a Christian, and then they get to decide even who was Christians. I know that all the way back from when I was 8, because I was deciding who was a Christian and who wasn't. I had them all, I couldn't even go to church with my Baptist friend because they weren't real Christians. I mean, how goofy is that? But at that point, they will be starting to sort through all the denominations to deciding who's a Christian and who's not. Christian in name only. They'll just keep working it down. But that's part of this whole history framing deal, is to reframe it back over into the world of, are you civilized or uncivilized based on your conformity to this Puritan, that Puritan strain of Christianity all the way back from the foundation of America, that they're trying to like regulate and calibrate everything and back over to that.
Okay. Sam, can you take the lapel mic around to get questions from people?
While you're getting them out back, also this whole redoing our Oklahoma history, it's also as a refute to 1619 project. That's the other reason why they're doing it. They don't like 1619, so they're like, we're not gonna do that, we're gonna do this. And that's why textbook publishers are pulling out of the state of Oklahoma, because they're not gonna redo a book for Oklahoma. So that's why they're pulling out. Okay.
Okay, so if Oklahoma was not a non-voting state, if we actually voted more than half, would that make a difference? Is the stuff that Andy Moore is doing with Let's Fix This, it sounds like he's making a little bit of a difference. Would it make a difference? And if it would, how do we get that done? I know Andy's doing some stuff.
My bottom line is, yes, we have to have more than 50% of the people registered to vote, and we need more than 50% of the 50% showing up on election day. I think it is because the loss of moral agency of white Christian women is the reason why I think that this is a dynamic in Oklahoma. White Christian women have a hierarchy of their moral agency, like a right from wrong. I think this is right, I think this is wrong, or this is what God wants me to do. A woman sitting here, God wants me to do this. This is the morally right thing to do. Whenever we have that vision in Oklahoma, I have to go over here and set up a meeting with my pastor to see, is it okay with you if God called me to do this and then I have to have your approval? So, or my husband's or my uncle's or the patriarchy has to come back in and give me a thumbs up. And that process of getting that thumbs up and not getting it, or not being able to serve communion because you're a woman, or not being able to lead a prayer because you're a woman, or not being able to have a job because you're a woman, or you can't have more money because you're a woman, that systemic whittling away whittles away our moral agency. And when you whittle away moral agency, when you show up at the voting block, either you're marginalized and you don't participate, because that sucks. Nobody likes to have your moral agency taken away or whittled away. So either you don't show up, or when you do show up, you're voting for the approval of your religious leaders. In Oklahoma, because we are very, like we are religiously, and it's very heavy Baptist, there's all these reinforcers that you are a bad woman if you go out and exercise the moral agency that Jesus gave you through what he did on the cross. And that, yes, you should check in with people because you're in a social setting. And I'll give you one little example. One time I dented this lady's van. It was a white Lexus SUV with my mom soccer van, Sienna van. The wind blew it, smacked a hole in it, big old little dent. I found out, I told her, hey, I'm gonna fix that. The bill comes back $500 to fix that little dent. And my husband's like, why'd you tell her you would fix that? Like, why'd you hunt her down? Why didn't you just slink away and nobody would know? Because I did have that option. And at some point in the fuss, now we're much more mature than this now. And I'm telling you, this is not something we do anymore. But I just looked at him in the face and I said, are you making me pick between you and God? And I think with reproductive rights and things like that, about what women know, what women need in those vulnerable places, and the freedom to make decisions with our doctors and our families, a lot of times that's what's happening in Oklahoma. So yes, it would make a huge difference. And that's what I spend my time doing. That's why I think in the church and that's why I switched from Church of Christ to First Christian in Norman, is because the moral agency of women in the First Christian Church is much more honored and respected than it is in the denomination that I was raised in. And I felt like it was no longer appropriate for me to perpetuate that, because I was modeling that for men and women, that it was okay to step in the way of a woman's moral agency and her ability to work out her relationship with God. So yes, I think we need almost an Arab Spring of women in Oklahoma to step into their moral agency and to stop this thumbs up hierarchy of moral agency.
I think that's really good. I think the only thing I would add is that, so some of the most progressive doors I've ever knocked, conversations I've ever had have been in rural Oklahoma, right? And I'm saying that because, like, as a community organizer, my quote unquote superpower is to be able to meet people where they are with language, right? I grew up in small town Oklahoma. And the thing is, like, if I go to every door and I say, and don't you think that trans people deserve rights, right? There's a good chance that they'll probably say, I really don't know about that, right? But if you go to someone in rural Oklahoma and say, and don't you think that you deserve that to be able to, one, afford health care when you need to get help, right? And two, that your healthcare decisions are between you, your family, and whoever your healthcare provider is, they'll say, yeah, I think so, right? And you ask them, and don't you think that everybody else should have that same right too? Yeah, I think so, right? Um, uh, and like, that's the thing, right? Is that, like, I know that every conversation that I have with the folks in House District 88 is a conversation that we need to have across the state, but I know that it looks different in these different places, right? And I appreciate the work that Andy Moore does because I think it's along those lines, right? But also, right, like, we are fighting an uphill battle, right, that I hope a lot of us are ready and willing to engage in, but it's also to make sure that people understand that, like, if we don't get involved in politics now, right, it is going to continue to erode our personal lives, right, especially right here in our state, right? If we don't continue to engage and say, like, you know, I might not feel personally affected by the book bans right now because I'm not in school, right? But if we don't do the phone calls, right? If we don't send the emails, because Oklahoma is one of the few places in the state legislature anyway, right, where we don't get a public comment section, right? But we have heard, like, at least on the House side of things, like, if you just get them to stop making the phone calls, get them to stop doing the emails, then we won't hear the bill, you know? Like, those things help, right? But yeah, it's hard to continue to show up to your elected officials if you continue to say, like, okay, well, I asked to be heard or cared for in this specific way, and you continuously showed me that you didn't care, right? You didn't care or value my voice, so, like, why should I show up, right? And if your elected official doesn't hear or value your voice, and, like, I don't know, maybe you should run for office, think about it. I don't know, but, like, yeah, it is, and, like, especially, like, with this younger, large voting pool coming up, right? It's like, that's what we're fighting too, right? It's like kids who have seen continuously politicians say, and I know how you should live your life according to my doctrine, right? And not even, I think it's important, right, that white Christian nationalism, right, growing up in Oklahoma, the buckle of the Bible Belt, I understand that white Christian nationalism and the Christian religion are completely two different things, right? And I think there's this thing where folks also have to understand, well, for me, like, it was also kind of like this door flying open when I realized that, like, I had suffered religious trauma at the hands of people who thought they were religious, not actually, like, religious trauma from the doctrine, right? From the books that I read and things like that. It is often that we are suffering trauma from people who claim to be religious, who claim to understand how to interpret things and tell you what's best for your life via their interpretation. And I, like, and so, yeah, it's big. I think the work that Andy Moore is doing is absolutely phenomenal, and we also have to be ready and willing to jump in and not just say, like, oh, okay, like, yeah, Andy's got it, let's help him out, you know? Like, let's figure out how to have those conversations with our friends and with our neighbors too, about, like, why it's important that we are, because language is so important to be able to meet people where they are and bring them to this finish line of liberation, right? Like, that's really, really important.
So are you saying that at this point, the people that vote in Oklahoma, the major voting bloc is men over the age of 30 or 40? Representative Boren, based on what you were saying about women.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the women who vote are predominantly aligning themselves and assimilating themselves over into the mindset of their economic security and their social status. And they're not willing and they don't know how. It's almost like you have to go through the steps of going through removing yourself from domestic violence, because it's the same steps, that you have moral agency, that you have economic security, and that they don't get to control your social status based on your conformity to their demands. But Oklahoma is, I would say, When teachers vote for Ryan Walters, that's how you can, because 80% of the teachers in Oklahoma are white women or more. It might be higher than that. So when teachers vote for Ryan Walters, they're doing it, the only way I can explain it is that they don't know how to sacrifice status and economic security in order to advance their own moral agency. So they surrender moral agency because their economic security and their status are hitched to some assimilating favor, and they see their world that way. And if you want to make it really, really horrible and really make your stomach hurt about this, you know, all the writings of Baldwin, all the way about how people will twist themselves into this warped version of themselves to appease their oppressor. And then it's just like, hey, I don't want my head shoved in the toilet in the locker room, so I'm going to go suck up to the bully so that they don't do that to me. And then it's somewhere along the way, you think the bully really likes you and really respects you, and they never do. And then you find yourself constantly trying to appease this abusive authority. And that's what psychologists have done to explain the whole Trump thing, of why these pitiful, beat down people keep propping him up. And they have been conditioned to prop up abusers with the hope that they won't hurt them. And it's a horrible thing that happens with kids that have been traumatized through that. The way they see authority is they see it as inherently abusive, and so then they're just picking which abuser that they're going to align themselves with, and it's horrible. But there's a version of that that I think that on a continuum, and then if you add to it that the proper role of a godly woman is to be subservient, to align herself to this, and it's good for the family, and my kids are better off because I looked the other way while he was being a jerk and bullying me or bullying other people, or just not taking into consideration my particular view. But that's all over Oklahoma. So that's what I'm saying. That's why women vote for Ryan Walters and other interests that seem so opposite of what women need.
Why don't we have, Joe, do you have a question? Why don't we have one more question to end? Joe doesn't. Margie has a question.
I have a question. Any possibility of getting rid of straight party voting?
Yes, I had the bill to do that. I think that should be our next initiative petition. I know right now they're trying to do open primary. There's mumblings about that. But if I had my top #1 next initiative petition, it would be to get rid of straight party voting.
Can you add on to that? I understood that they were trying to get rid of initiative petitions so that we wouldn't have that.
Those bills didn't advance very well. They're
This
just
was
kind
a
of,
question about initiative petitions.
yeah, that there were some bills to try to make it harder for initiative petitions, but those just kind of floundered around. So, and I think it's because they're up to stuff and they know. I think they're trying to do something, probably with reproductive health, or because the Supreme Court came out. So they're probably up to something, and they still need that lower 50%. And they don't want to make it harder yet. But as soon as they get reproductive health on the ballot to try to overturn Roe v. Wade in our Constitution, and to codify in our Constitution really restrictive reproductive health, then they may go back in and try to up the bar to do initiative petitions.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're about 20 minutes over. I want to thank the panelists for staying extra time to talk to us. So,
Well, and I just want to say to you all, give yourself a pat on the back. You sacrificed a Saturday to think about really hard things, and your circle of influence is huge. All of you have people that rely on you for guidance. And, you know, you could get on the phone right now and you could probably talk for 15 minutes to a different person, and you could probably fill out the next from today to tomorrow about going through and checking in on people and seeing how that they're doing on this topic. So please don't underestimate that the size of who we are and what we're doing don't matter, because the resistance that America has had towards justice has always looked like this. It has never looked like Trump rallies. It has always looked like small rooms with a collection of people that are carrying the torch, like the monarch butterfly going through from Canada to Mexico and just passing that on to the next little butterfly to make sure they get all the way down to Mexico. And I think that that's what our job is. And you all did that. You carried the torch for this version of the path. And please, please, please know that Mauree and I both, when we ran for office, we wanted to meet the people in Oklahoma that cared like you all do. That's why it's not a hard sacrifice for us to show up, because when we ran, we wanted to meet the people that cared and that we're going to make a difference and that we're going to fight against that. And by you showing up today, we know that we're not alone, that there are decent, good people that are committed to the good of others, and that you're willing to sacrifice a lot. And I think, to answer your question, until we sacrifice something, status or wealth, in order to make that change, we're not going to see a difference. You cannot get to where we want to go until people of status and wealth are sacrificing something in those two categories. In order, you have to align yourself with the scorned in order to make progress. And that's what you all did today. And I really appreciate you all doing that. And I know that you are honoring your faith and you're honoring your God in a very mighty way because of you sacrificing the way you did today. So thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. I appreciate you all being here today.
Thank you. And they'd love to get feedback, so I encourage you to come up and talk to Senator Boren and Representative Turner afterwards, so they can hear more about what's on your mind. All right, thank you for coming. It's been another wonderful event. I don't know if we'll have a third White Christian Nationalism event. The next major event at this church will be on leap year day, Thursday night, February 29th. John Deere, the Jesuit priest, former Jesuit priest, and 3 times nominated for Nobel Peace Prize, once by Desmond Tutu, will be here to speak about a new commentary that he's written on Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and it's from the perspective of nonviolence. John Deere's been here 3 times. He is pure gospel when he speaks, and he has lived the life. He's been arrested 75 times. He's on terrorist lists. He has a hard time flying because he did a plowshares movement by taking a hammer to a jet that carried nuclear weapons. Okay.
Thank you, thank you.
We'll send you an email about that.